seventh event that gave the United States a black eye on civil rights during the Kennedy administration was the Birmingham church bombing, which is on your ID sheet. Birmingham church bombing. And unfortunately, this is going to follow the March on Washington when something very positive happened concerning civil rights during the Kennedy administration. But event number 7 is going to put kind of a damper on that. And that event number 7 is Birmingham church bombing, and it occurred on September 15th, 1963. September 15th, 1963. Probably the worst crime of the civil rights era. September 15th, 1963, arguably the worst crime of the civil rights era. In Birmingham, Alabama, there was a church called the 16th Street Baptist Church. 16th Street Baptist Church. Very popular church in Birmingham, especially for African Americans. And on September 15th, 1963, at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, 4 young girls that were attending Sunday school were killed when a bomb exploded inside the church. So on September 15th, 1963, arguably one of the worst crimes of the civil rights era occurred at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, when 4 young girls attending Sunday school were killed when a bomb exploded inside the church. All 4 of these girls were under the age of 14. They were under the age of 14. And they're listed on your ID sheet. Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins. So these young girls that were killed in this church bombing are all under the age of 14 and including Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins. I'll give you time to write those down. 4 young girls under the age of 14. Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins. Including those 4 deaths were 20 others that were injured. 20 others were injured in that church bombing. So in addition to the 4 deaths, 20 others were injured, including 12-year-old Sarah Jean Collins. So in addition to Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins, 20 others were injured, including a 12-year-old girl by the name of Sarah Jean Collins. And her injuries resulted in her being blinded in one eye for life. She was blinded in one eye for life. And also, what was she? Sister of Addie Mae Collins. So she was lucky to survive that. So 20 others were injured in this church bombing, including 12-year-old Sarah Jean Collins, who was blinded in one eye for life. Now you think about this. Less than a month after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, it was pretty evident that we were a long ways away from that dream that he envisioned. Well, 4 white supremacists were under investigation within days of the bombing. 4 white supremacists were under investigation within 4 days. They had 4 white supremacists that they suspected of being involved in this bombing. Unfortunately, after 2 years without a conviction, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declined to continue. So they had 4 people under investigation within days, but because Hoover believed the chances of winning a conviction on those 4 were very remote, federal authorities shut down their investigation, and it went unsolved. So again, 4 white supremacists were under investigation within days of the bombing, but after 2 years without a conviction, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declined to continue the case. He believed the chances of conviction were remote, and federal authorities shut down their investigation. Well, what happened in the mid-1970s? What? Well, They are going to, but what happened first before that happened? Prosecutors reopened it, thank you. They reopened the case. And finally, in 1977, about nearly 14 years after the crime, a man was convicted in this church bombing. So with new evidence in the mid-1970s, prosecutors reopened this case, and finally in 1977, nearly 14 years after the event, prosecutors convicted a man for the crime. His name was Robert Chambliss. Robert Chambliss. Robert Chambliss. Now, he was convicted of one count of murder in the death of Denise McNair. So that's what they got him for. It was a stretch, but they went and proved that he was the ringleader of this bombing that happened 14 years earlier, and he was convicted of one count of murder in the death of Denise McNair. But that was enough to sentence him to prison for life. And he died there in 1985. Did the prosecutors give up? Because they were a little upset. They knew there were 4. They did get the one guy convicted. They didn't give up. And 2 of the 3 other suspects were convicted in the year 2000, both given life sentences as well. So they convicted 2 of the other 3 in 2000. They would not let this go. They felt this was a horrific crime. Prosecutors were relentless. And in 2000, they convicted 2 more of the 4. 2 of the 3 remaining, and they were both given life sentences. And the only reason the 4th guy avoided prosecution is because what? He died. He died. So they actually more or less received justice on most of them, okay? So Robert Chambliss was the ringleader. He was the first that was convicted in 1977. But they continued on this. They were relentless. And in 2000, 2 of the other 3 remaining suspects in the case were convicted. And the only reason the 4th man avoided prosecution, because they were hot on his trail, was because he died. So they'd have got all 4 if they had time. That is the 7th event. 7th event. Now I'm going to give you a quick review, and then we're going to watch a video. Okay? Here's what you need to know for tomorrow. If I was you, I would get a highlighter or a pen and just get on your green ID sheet and mark these names. And then you can go back and, get them later instead of trying to fight through your notes. But here's who you need to know. These are the people you need to know that will be used in matching tomorrow. Okay? Sarah Jean Collins. She'll be toward the end of your green sheet. Sarah Jean Collins. Carl Rowan. Carl Rowan. He'd be more towards the front. But kind of in order from this point on to a point. Andrew Hacker. Thurgood Marshall. John Siegenthaler. Robert Chambliss. I think we just talked about him, didn't we? James Meredith. He's not on your sheet because we had talked about him before, but we know he's the Air Force veteran who was denied admission initially at the University of Mississippi. You can look that up. Ross Barnett. Ralph Abernathy. Bayard Rustin. Now what's the difference between Ralph Abernathy and Bayard Rustin? They were 2 of the first men to join the SCLC with Martin Luther King Jr., but what separates them?
Bayard Rustin organized
Very good. Bayard Rustin was the man that organized the March on Washington. Okay, you need to know Bull Connor. George Wallace. Nicholas Katzenbach. Vivian Malone. Byron De La Beckwith. Bob Dylan. A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Walter Rather, and George Raveling. Here's some other things you need to know that would be in the form of short answers. I would know several examples of Jim Crow laws. Several examples of Jim Crow laws. I would know Attorney General Robert Kennedy's reaction to the events of Birmingham, Alabama with the Freedom Riders. I would know the reaction and what Bobby Kennedy did after hearing about the events in Birmingham concerning the Freedom Riders. I would know some of those unconventional weapons that were used by police during the SCLC's visit to Birmingham. Some of those unconventional weapons. And I would know what the bill that eventually became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what it called for, the two things it called for. And then we would spend a little time and watch that thing on George Raveling on the video. I would know a little bit about that. If you didn't get to see it or you want to see it again, it is posted on the website under video, and you can watch it again if you want to. But I want you to know something about that story. Okay? Any questions on any of those people or any of what's going to be on the test tomorrow? There's going to be 20 matching, obviously, right? Because there's 20 names, and then 10 answers of the short answer variety.
What was that last one you said?
The video on George Raveling we watched, just don't need to know something. You know, I'll ask you a question off that video. Okay?
Mr. Kurt, when did you watch that video?
We would have watched it during the lecture after the March on Washington. It's on the website. I know it is after the
You watched it Thursday?
We watched it after we lectured on the March on Washington. It was real short. Remember about the speech and how much he paid, got asked for, you know, he offered for it, and where he had it, and all that kind of business. Okay, Mary, if you'd be kind enough to shut the door and get the lights, we'll watch this. Hey, I want you to open up your notebooks and follow through this with your notebooks, because this is the line we're using on the lecture to make sure you didn't miss anything here. This is very good. Short excerpt from CBS News. You're going to have to kind of be quiet because I recorded this many years ago, and it's not stereo, so it's out of one speaker. And evidently it's this one.
This was the day the power of the civil rights movement came home to most Americans. A steamy August day in 1963, when 200,000 people, black and white, marched on Washington to demand of their government a legal end to segregation. I have a dream. It was also the day that many Americans heard for the first time the powerful eloquence of Martin Luther King. The march, the movement, and the man at its center. On this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. America was a different country back in 1963. The Deep South, the solid core of the old Confederacy, was still locked in the grip of legal segregation. Jim Crow laws that consigned Negroes to the back of the bus and barred them from many restaurants and a host of public establishments. I said Negroes, for that is what most African Americans called themselves in those days. Many white Americans called them names that do not bear repeating. But the times were about to change. For in August of 1963, the forces for social and political change came marching into the nation's capital.
The long long-awaited March for Jobs and Freedom on Washington, D.C. has started, and it started early without its scheduled leaders. About 10 minutes ago, the march began, broke out of the grounds around Washington Monument. About half of the 100,000 estimated crowd headed off down Constitution Avenue, headed towards the Lincoln Memorial, which is where we're seated now.
The March on Washington was the culmination of a long and perilous odyssey that began back in 1954, when the Supreme Court had declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. That decision began the fight that became the Civil Rights Movement. In towns and cities throughout the South, Martin Luther King and many others started fighting for equal access to public facilities. They encountered resistance everywhere. But in the summer of 1963, three events put the Civil Rights Movement in the national spotlight and set the stage for the March on Washington. The first event was Birmingham. Martin Luther King always picked his battles carefully, but in May of '63, he went up against a firestorm.
This is Birmingham, the South's mightiest industrial city as the world knew it this week. These are the front lines of the battle between Dr. Martin Luther King's Negro Disciples of Nonviolence and the uniformed forces of Birmingham led by Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor.
It makes me sick, said President Kennedy when he saw the pictures, and the country shared his revulsion. The second event that summer was the president's address to the nation supporting a civil rights bill. John Kennedy had been reluctant to back civil rights legislation because he didn't want to alienate the Southern Democratic coalition in Congress. Birmingham changed all that.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments.
And the third event came within hours of the president's speech. In a sudden, bloody moment, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was assassinated.
Somebody poked a rifle through the wire fence and shot Medgar Evers in the back. Negroes have been lynched before, but the aroused temper of the times and the vicious circumstances of the act seem to be turning this murder into a rallying cry.
The March on Washington.
And so, after Birmingham and the death of Medgar Evers, and now with the power of the presidency behind them, Martin Luther King and the other leaders planned what would be the largest demonstration in the nation's history to support the Civil Rights Bill.
We are calling for a non-violent, peaceful march on Washington. And we want to go there not by the hundreds, not by the thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands. And I believe
the organizers wanted numbers, but most of all, they wanted peace. This would be the showcase for the non-violent movement.
Watch your Washington buses right here for sale. We're taking 25-cent donations for these buses.
And in communities throughout the country, local leaders stressed the need for tight discipline.
The press has alluded to the fact that there will possibly be disorder, but we are sure that there will be no disorder on our part.
And so on August 28th, they came. One young man came 1,000 miles from Chicago on roller skates.
I let my legs do most of the talking.
200,000 people were there, but millions watched.
And that's the way it's been here, right along. There's been a good deal of enthusiasm, mostly shown by the younger people, a good deal of singing, but also there's been a solemn note in the air here.
This march for a cause that had seen so much violence raised fears of large-scale rioting. The city of Washington shut down for the day, but the leaders were determined. There was something important to prove here.
This is the first time in the history of the world that a bunch of Negroes have ever been invited anywhere. And we didn't come to fight, believe me.
The man who brought them here, the chief organizer, reminded them why they came.
The president of the Sleeping Car Porters Union and a vice president of the AFL-CIO, A. Philip Randolph.
We are not a mob. We are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. This revolution reverberates throughout the land, touching every city, every town, every village where black men are segregated, oppressed, and exploited.
In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution had canceled a Marian Anderson concert. Canceled it because Miss Anderson was black. Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, 24 years later, she came back.
In his hand he's got the wind and the rain. In his hand he's got the whole world in his hand.
The Queen of Gospel, Mahalia Jackson, added drama and a certain joy to the day-long affair. But this was as rowdy as it got that day. From beginning to end, the march was so orderly that except for caring for those who couldn't deal with the heat,